girl walked only a few meters from the school bus to her home, and then it seemed as if she simply dissolved into thin air. Her disappearance quickly attracted the attention of the entire city, as amazing new details kept coming to light during the investigation. Over many years, the investigators deciphered the mysterious sequence of events with enormous effort and tireless dedication, until they finally uncovered the shocking truth. Angie Guzman was born on the 18th of February 1984 in St. Louis, Missouri. Her father left the family before her birth, and she never saw him. When she was 1 year old, her mother married Ronald, who became like a real father to Angie, and soon afterward, a son was born. Angie always got along well with her stepfather and younger brother, was a peace-loving child, and tried to make friends with everyone in her environment. The family lived in a quiet residential area in St. Louis, where everyone looked out for the neighbors. 9-year-old Angie attended 4th grade at a local elementary school in 1993, which was only a few hundred meters from her home. She rode the bus to school, whose stop was near her house, and the friendly neighbors always kept an eye on the children when they came home. It was a local tradition to ensure that the children were doing well. On the 18th of November, Angie went to school as usual and was supposed to return home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She got on the school bus and reached her stop together with some children from the neighborhood, after which they went home together. When all the other children had gone home, Angie was alone. She had only a few minutes left to walk. But time passed, and Angie did not come home. After the bus had dropped off the children and about 30 minutes had passed, the parents began to worry. Normally, Angie lingered a little to talk with friends, but this time her delay was unusually long. Angie's mother and stepfather decided to check the path from the stop to their house. They spoke with other students who confirmed that the girl had arrived together with them and had set off for home. The parents became increasingly concerned. They turned to the neighbors who normally kept an eye on the children, but this time the women were busy and had noticed nothing unusual. Other parents too, whose houses lay along the street, had seen how Angie was going home. Family and friends began to thoroughly search the area along the route. When it became dark, the parents decided to ask the police for help. The investigators immediately joined the search. Given the cool weather, it was unlikely that Angie had gone alone. The police considered various possibilities, as just 10 days earlier, a similar incident with another girl had occurred in the neighboring district, which fortunately had ended well, but had triggered serious concern. In late March 2022, when a young woman had just left the school bus, a stranger tried to take her with him. Despite the threat, she managed to escape capture. This incident prompted law enforcement authorities to think about a possible connection of this event to the disappearance of a girl named Angie. In searching for her, service dogs were used, which discovered a trail at the bus stop and followed it to a point where the trail suddenly ended, which could indicate that Angie was taken away in a car. Despite the use of helicopters with thermal imaging cameras to check the surroundings on the first day of the search, no clues about the girl's whereabouts were found. On the morning of the following day, the police turned to local media and the news of the missing person spread quickly. On this day alone, more than 300 calls came in, which required the deployment of more than 20 additional officers to process the incoming information. The investigations also extended to Angie's stepfather, who denied any involvement and offered to undergo any checks to prove his innocence. The behavior of the girl's biological father, who maintained no contact with her and was observed from a distance, also drew the police's attention and brought a new turn to the investigation, which intensified interest in his person in the context of the ongoing investigations. The police intensified their efforts to investigate Angie's disappearance in March, after a resident was observed driving slowly through the area in a blue sedan. This person was seen under suspicious circumstances 10 days before the disappearance. Despite his claims to have an alibi the day before the events, the FBI and local authorities created a composite sketch of him and distributed it among the residents. The distribution of thousands of flyers and nationwide coverage did not lead to identifying this man. This drew public attention and many tips, which, however, did not bring the police closer to a solution. Angie's teacher told that shortly before her disappearance, She had spoken of an upcoming trip to nature with her uncle. Meanwhile, the increased public interest attracted psychics, who began to share their visions over the phone at Angie's house. One of them claimed that she was alive and hiding in a national park, 40 kilometers from her home. The investigators, however, concentrated on more tangible clues and ignored these statements. In hope of speeding up the process, a reward of $10,000 was offered for information about Angie's whereabouts, which led to even more tips. It was strange that her parents knew nothing about an alleged trip that she had mentioned. It was suspected that Angie knew someone who had taken her along. 9 days after her disappearance, a hunter in the national park came across a disturbing discovery in the forest and immediately informed the police. At the scene, traces of a makeshift shelter were found, and beside it lay personal items, including a notebook with the young woman's name. This event attracted considerable public and media attention. Angie was found in a condition that triggered serious concern for her well-being and confirmed the severity of her situation. The police also found evidence that the young woman must have been in the shelter recently. Fingerprints on the objects in the shelter gave hope for a quick resolution of the case. The condition of the found objects led the experts to conclude that Angie was in the shelter until the last hours before her discovery. At the end of March 2022, after unsuccessful attempts to link the disappearance with other similar cases in the databases, the police doubled their efforts in the investigation after a discovery in one of the houses. The city residents became more cautious and began to watch their children more closely. A few days after the beginning of the investigation, public concern intensified. At the beginning of December, a girl named Casey disappeared in a city that was 16 kilometers away from the location of the first missing person report. Casey set off to her friends, who lived only a few hundred meters from her home, but never arrived there. 10 days later, Casey was found in St. Louis. She was covered with a pink curtain. However, the details of what had happened remained unclear. Despite intensive searching for clues, the police could not draw any clear conclusions about the connection of this case to other incidents in the city. In the same month, the police arrested a person who was trying to disturb another young woman only a few days before Casey's disappearance. Initially, it was suspected that it might be the same person, but differences in the circumstances allowed for the possibility that the crimes were committed by different people. At the end of March 2022, Gary, a 37-year-old man, often visited St. Louis on business. In the context of investigating two disappearances, the investigators considered him as a possible suspect. But he could present a solid alibi, as he was not in the city at the time of the events. In the further course of the investigations, however, it turned out that Gary had behaved inappropriately toward 4 other people, which finally led to his conviction to 5 years of imprisonment. In February of the following year, the police made a new discovery. They found Casey's remains. Nearby, vehicle tracks were found, which experts later attributed to a pickup that is frequently used by a rental company. The investigators began to question the residents of the area where the pickup was found. A woman reported that she had seen such a vehicle near her neighbor's house. About a week after the disappearance, the police visited this house. The woman living there, who lived together with her life partner and her brother, claimed that none of them had rented such a pickup and were not involved in the matter. However, the police did not believe her words, obtained a search warrant, and discovered during the search in the basement traces that were connected to Casey, as well as objects that had to do with the case. In the course of further investigations, it turned out that the brother had rented the pickup, whereupon he was arrested. Initially, he denied everything, but after being presented with solid evidence, the man admitted his actions. He explained that Casey came to him on her own to invite his nephew for a walk. In the house, he suggested going to the basement, where he tried to do something that I cannot say on YouTube, but she screamed. In the resulting panic, he accidentally pushed her, and she fell unluckily, whereupon he covered her with sheets. Thomas went to work, and when he returned, he learned from his sister that she had seen something concerning in his basement. She asked him to quickly remove everything without wanting to know details. She remained in the basement for a week, as the city was intensively searching for the missing girl and Thomas was afraid to transport her. As soon as the situation calmed down, he rented a truck, drove her to St. Louis, and left her there. Ultimately, the man received the harshest possible sentence, but died a few years later in custody from an illness. In Angie's case, he denied any guilt, and the investigators concluded that the crimes were not connected to each other. The investigations came to a standstill for months. The police still received tips, although their number decreased. Years after Angie's murder, when the deadline for the financial reward offer expired, the investigators feared a reduction in public support. But then came an unexpected turn. A local businessman donated $250,000 as a reward for information about Angie's case, which at that time was one of the most significant amounts. And indeed, the investigators began to receive more information. Until the year 2001, all leads led to a dead end. But the situation changed abruptly when an unexpected call came in from a correctional facility. The prisoner, Corey Fox, claimed he had been involved in a series of disappearances, including the disappearance of Angie Guzman. The investigators immediately set out to him to learn details. Fox claimed he and an accomplice had lured Angie into an abandoned building to hide there. Originally, the perpetrators planned to demand ransom, but later decided, out of fear of discovery, to eliminate all traces. He described everything that happened down to the smallest detail. But his story contained contradictions. For example, Fox mentioned plastic ties, although metal ties were actually used. His confession to other crimes that he could not have physically committed raised further doubts. This led the police to suspect that he might be relying on information from the news. In the summer 2002, the case gained attention again when a young woman disappeared in another district of St. Louis. Initially, it was assumed that the same perpetrator was at work, but it quickly turned out that it was a different criminal who was arrested the same day. After several years, the investigators decided in the year 2007 to reopen an old case. When reviewing the files, they noticed an interesting fact. Roger Martin's car was parked near the discovery site. Roger claimed he had come hunting, but had no equipment for it with him. The new investigation team decided to pay special attention to this man. After checking his background, it turned out that Roger had previously acted unlawfully. Furthermore, Roger had been involved in an unpleasant incident near the discovery site a few years before the find. This information was recorded in the database, but at the time, the police had not seriously suspected him. To correct this, the investigators invited Roger to a 9-hour interrogation. Despite all efforts, they could not obtain a confession or useful information from him. After the interrogation, they compared his fingerprints with those that had been found earlier, but found that they did not match. Roger insisted on his innocence and assured that he had been at work at the time of the incident, but the police could not confirm his alibi. Despite the absence of direct evidence of his guilt, the investigators continued to consider him as a possible suspect in this puzzling case. After a long phase in which the investigation stagnated, the administration of St. Louis founded a special task force in the year 2018 to dedicate itself once again to this difficult case. New investigators were ready to examine in detail all evidence collected since 1993. Technological progress gave hope for a breakthrough. 3 important pieces of evidence included handcuffs, tape, and a piece of clothing that was placed in Angie's mouth. Experts had previously unsuccessfully tried to find traces of the perpetrator's genetic material on them. Despite earlier failures, the investigators decided to re-examine all materials with modern technology. First, the experts concentrated on the handcuffs, but a thorough examination showed that the entire surface was saturated with the victim's blood. Therefore, hope for a DNA analysis of this piece of evidence quickly disappeared. Then the team turned to the tape. But when they opened the box with the evidence, they found that the tape had completely dissolved over the years. The last piece of evidence was the underwear. The entire team knew that this was their last hope. Despite the obvious contact of the perpetrator with this piece of evidence, the long contact with Angie could have erased all traces. Nevertheless, the experts decided to apply the most modern analytical methods and examine every millimeter of the fabric. And suddenly they found a tiny DNA fragment of unknown origin that was sufficient for analysis and finally brought the long-awaited breakthrough in this case. Specialists determined that the found DNA sample belonged to a man and immediately entered it into the FBI database. The perpetrators are often not found in this database, so considerable efforts are required to determine their identity. This time, however, the investigators were lucky. The match was found immediately. It was Earl Cox, who was 58 years old when he went to prison in the year 2003. Previously, he had not been connected with the Angie case, but he had a criminal past. Earl was first convicted in the year 1982 when he was serving in the army in Germany and working as a babysitter. Everything went well, until some girls told their parents that something unwanted had happened. Earl was sentenced to 8 years in prison and discharged from the military. He spent 3 years in prison and was released on parole, after which he moved to St. Louis. 4 years later, he was arrested on new charges, but due to insufficient evidence, the charges were dropped, and he was not punished. However, his arrest violated his parole conditions, so he had to spend another year in prison. After his release, Earl returned to St. Louis to his relatives. It is suspected that he might have been involved in an incident with Angie a year later, but the details are still unclear. In the year 2002, he was arrested again. It turned out that Earl had organized a network for exchanging inappropriate materials that I cannot name on YouTube, but his story suggests what it was about. Earl was arrested in the year 2003 during a months-long FBI operation. An undercover investigator created an anonymous account and posed as a 14-year-old woman. Earl sent her money to travel to his city, but when he came to the agreed meeting point, armed investigators awaited him and arrested him. During the search of his house, 45,000 inappropriate photos and evidence of his role in a problematic online portal were found. Thanks to this evidence, 60 more people who were involved in the activities of this portal could be arrested, making this operation one of the largest in the country. Earl was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but after his sentence expired, the court extended his detention because he was classified as a potential danger to society. In the year 2019, his DNA was linked to another old case, leading investigators to the gates of his prison. Earl refused to speak with them and demanded a lawyer. The police, recognizing the severity of the evidence, offered Earl's lawyer an agreement, a guilty plea in exchange for a milder sentence, life imprisonment instead of the ultimate punishment. After realizing that his case might not be successful, Earl decided to make an agreement with the authorities. When they visited him again in prison, he described his version of events. Some points of his story sounded questionable, but the police were seeking a confession. Earl told that on the 18th of November 1993, he was driving through the neighborhood where his mother and sister lived when his car suddenly stopped. As he tried to find the reason for the breakdown, he noticed a school bus from which students were getting off. Everyone went home except for one girl who approached him and, as he says, started a conversation. Believing that she might be cold, Earl offered her to get into his car, and she agreed. The investigators doubted his story. First, the girl probably would not have agreed to go with a person unknown to her, especially when her house was only a few dozen meters away. Second, the investigators did not believe that his car had broken down. Although Earl said that the engine stalled, he also claimed that the car started as soon as the girl approached him. Probably he noticed her and immediately decided to talk to her. Earl could get her to get into the car through various pretexts and even direct threats. This scenario seemed more plausible than his own explanations. However, the investigators' efforts resulted in Earl admitting his guilt. In August 2012, he was put on trial and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Unfortunately, Angie's mother, who died of an illness in the year 2016, could not experience this moment. Her husband Ronald stated that Earl should be held responsible for both losses, as he believes that losing his daughter took away his wife's life force. As for Earl, his case was not yet closed. The prosecution decided to review earlier accusations regarding inappropriate behavior for which he escaped punishment and spent only 1 year in prison due to a violation of the conditions of his earlier release. The police contacted one of the victims, now an adult, who agreed to testify against Earl. This man, already sentenced to life imprisonment, pleaded guilty and received an additional 10-year prison sentence. After the verdict was announced, the victim testified in court that despite the severe trials, she strives to live happily and fulfilled, while he will remain behind bars.